The highest like comment on this channel's biggest video quotes Tolkien. Evil can't create anything new. It can only corrupt and ruin what good forces have created. The Emperor didn't just agree with that principle. He built the entire Imperium on it. That exact phrasing doesn't appear verbatim in any Tolkien text. Two separate authentic formulations exist. In Morgoth's Ring, the 10th volume of the History of Middle-earth, Tolkien writes plainly, "Evil can't make, it can only mar." In The Lord of the Rings, the narrative voice describes Morgoth's creatures as evidence that the shadow that bred them can only mock, it can't make, not real new things of its own. Treebeard makes the same point in The Two Towers, identifying trolls as counterfeits of Ents and Orcs as counterfeits of Elves, not original creations but parodies of things already made by someone else. The comment distills both lines into one. The principle is genuine. The specific wording is composite. What most readers treat as a moral observation about evil, Tolkien developed as a structural rule, metaphysical architecture embedded into his entire mythology. Evil in his cosmology is literally constitutionally incapable of originating anything. This created genuine authorial problems. Tolkien spent years wrestling with the orc question in his late notes precisely because his own structural premise required that Morgoth couldn't have created a new, rational species from nothing. Orcs therefore had to derive from corrupted elves or corrupted men, which raised uncomfortable theological questions about the moral status of enslaved and tormented beings. Tolkien took the constraint seriously enough to let it produce real difficulties in his own work rather than abandon the rule for narrative convenience. Morgoth's history illustrates the operational implication. He was the most powerful of the Ainur, the first being to enter the physical world, and he spent his entire existence corrupting what others had made. Mountains he ruined. Forests he poisoned. Elves he captured and twisted into orcs. His primary instrument, Sauron, is himself a derivative. Tolkien's letter 153 states explicitly that Sauron was a spirit corrupted by the prime Dark Lord Morgoth, not a creation, a corruption. The most powerful villain of the Second and Third Ages, the architect of the One Ring, the near conqueror of Middle-earth, is, in his origins, a good thing that was broken. Tolkien wasn't writing allegory about a single enemy. He was describing a metaphysical condition. A comparable condition operates in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. The Chaos Gods are ancient, vast, and in most senses impossible to permanently destroy. They are emergent warp entities, consciousnesses that formed from the accumulated psychic and emotional output of mortal beings across millions of years. They arise from and feed on the emotions and beliefs of mortal consciousness, drawing sustenance from the psychic residue of war, despair, ambition, excess, and hope. They have existed for geological timescales. They command power that can crack continents and bend the laws of physics wherever the warp bleeds into real space. In all that time, across all that power, they have never built anything from nothing. What they have is what they took. What they are is what mortal consciousness generated before they existed to influence it. The Emperor recognized this, not as a philosophical insight he had late in his reign, but as an empirical fact he had been watching operate for millennia before the Great Crusade ever launched. The Emperor has existed on Terra since the Neolithic or early Mesopotamian period. He is a perpetual, canonically the first and greatest of an emerging subspecies of human psychers, biologically capable of recovering from injuries that would kill any other being, accumulating experience across spans of time that make most recorded civilizations look brief.
He didn't read about the age of strife in historical records.
He lived through it, watching it unfold from inside the catastrophe. The age of strife began somewhere in the mid-25th millennium, when massive warp storms simultaneously tore apart the first human interstellar civilization and triggered an uncontrolled explosion of psychic ability across thousands of isolated worlds. Humans with psychic powers they couldn't understand and couldn't contain began manifesting in enormous numbers. The warp responded. Demonic incursions stopped being isolated events and became endemic. Interstellar communication collapsed. Worlds cut off behind warp storms descended into their own particular catastrophes: plague, war, psychic horror, external predation from every xeno-species that had previously been held back by human expansion. On Terra, trillions died. The planet was never self-sufficient, and its population suffered accordingly. What followed were centuries of techno-barbarian warlords competing for control of a dying world. Some wielded demon-tainted technologies, some were possessed outright, some had made bargains with warp entities in exchange for power they didn't fully understand and couldn't ultimately keep. The Emperor observed warlord after warlord rise to dominance through chaos-mediated advantages, and then collapse, because chaos-mediated power structures are inherently unstable. They corrupt the foundations of their own operation. They require constant new material to degrade, and when the supply runs short, they turn inward on themselves. The pattern repeated across centuries of observation with no meaningful variation. Chaos could seize an existing military apparatus. It could corrupt an existing political order. It could weaponize an existing psychic talent. What it couldn't do was build a stable, self-sustaining civilization from scratch. Every chaos-touched power structure on Terra during the Age of Strife was a degraded version of something that had previously existed, running on borrowed time until the degradation became terminal. The Emperor observed this not once, not twice, but for the span of what we would call recorded history. By the time the Unification Wars concluded around 712 M30, Chris Wright's Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, establishes them as lasting approximately 250 years. The Emperor and his inner circle possessed full working knowledge of the Chaos Gods as effectively unassailable warp powers. The strategic framing had settled. Chaos can't be destroyed in any conventional military sense. What it can be is denied access, starved of material, and constrained to operating within limitations it can't overcome. The design problem wasn't how to kill chaos. It was how to build a civilization inside the gap chaos couldn't close. That problem produced three interlocking institutional answers. All three were operational at the start of the Great Crusade in 798 M30. The Astronomicon was built. The Webway project was underway. The Imperial Truth was deployed. This wasn't improvised response to emerging threats. It was premeditated architecture. Under the fortress called the Hollow Mountain in the Himalayan range, the mountain range we call the Himalayas, there is a chamber. It was the single largest artificial structure on Terra in the Great Crusade era. 10,000 specially trained psychers called the Chosen sit within it in rotating cohorts, pouring their psychic life force into a colossal apparatus that focuses and amplifies their collective output into a single signal. Up to 1,000 of them die every day, their life forces exhausted maintaining the beacon. Their ranks are continuously replenished from the Black Ship's harvest.
This is the physical reality of the Astronomicon, a navigation system powered by continuous human sacrifice. burning through lives at industrial scale to maintain the one fixed reference point that allows warp navigation across the entire Imperium. The fandom wiki defines it with precise language. The Astronomicon is ultimately calibrated and projected by the Emperor of Mankind from within the Golden Throne. Not emitted, not broadcast, calibrated and projected. Active verbs describing a signal the Emperor personally directs. During the early Great Crusade, before the Webway project consumed his full attention, he powered and directed it himself while simultaneously leading military campaigns off-world. He projected a 70,000 light-year signal across the galaxy and still had enough left over to kill in close combat. That range, 70,000 light-years, covering the majority of inhabited imperial space, though not the extreme eastern fringe, is a product of his psychic output directed through the chamber's apparatus. Cut the Emperor, cut the signal. The Imperium of 1,000,000 worlds fragments within a generation. Before the Astronomicon, warp navigation operated differently. Its functions were previously fulfilled by distributed warp beacons that projected stable signals for navigators to orient against. These formed a scattered network across multiple worlds, most of which were lost or forgotten during the Age of Strife. When the Emperor constructed the Astronomicon at the Great Crusade's start, he replaced a fragmented network of waypoints with a single point of psychic authority, controlled entirely by him. Every navigator in the Imperium is trained to detect the Astronomicon as the one fixed point in the otherwise chaotic immaterium. Without it, long-range warp travel would be rendered impossible. Ships would be limited to short-range jumps covering only a fraction of imperial space at a time. A 1,000,000-world empire conducting logistics on short hops isn't an empire. It's an extended collection of increasingly isolated systems with no practical coordination. The Astronomicon is what makes the Imperium scale possible, which means the Imperium scale depends at its foundation on a signal the Emperor personally controls. Chaos forces know this. Chaos ships don't navigate by the Astronomicon's light, and strongly chaos-aligned vessels recoil from its touch. Chaos navigators use alternative reference points, the Eye of Terror as a warp waypoint, sorceress guidance, demonic intermediaries, renegade navigator lineages. Some orient around the Astronomicon the way you might navigate around a blinding source of light, using it as a positional reference without looking directly at it, but they avoid it. Chaos-aligned vessels recoil from it. The primary chaos navigational anchor in the galaxy is a point of chaos-created corruption, not an emperor-built beacon. No canonical source explicitly labels the Astronomicon as terrain management. The lore describes it as a navigation beacon, and that is what it is. But the structural logic of the situation is visible in the canon without requiring additional framing. All sustainable long-range imperial movement is oriented toward a signal the Emperor designed and controls. Chaos forces avoid that signal by stated canonical fact. Chaos can't build a competing signal of equivalent psychic authority. The movements that result in actual coordinated strategic action, sustained across the distances an interstellar empire requires, flow through channels the Astronomicon illuminates. Chaos operates everywhere the Astronomicon doesn't reach, and it can't create new beacons to extend its own reliable operating range. The Astronomicon was always the provisional layer. It was the infrastructure the Emperor needed while he finished the real solution. The Webway wasn't built by the Eldar. The Fandom Wiki's Webway entry is direct. The Webway was created by the Old Ones, a species that
established an interstellar empire across the galaxy, tens of millions of standard years before the development of most of the other self-aware species. The Eldar were taught to use the webway and became its most accomplished navigators after the Old One's disappearance. But the architecture, the psychic wards, the dimensional partitioning, the composition of the tunnels themselves, is the product of a creative intelligence that predates the Eldar by geological timescales. This matters because the webway's structural properties are built in at a level chaos can't replicate or reverse engineer. The fandom wiki describes it as a hyperdimensional construct occupying the space between real space and the immaterium, protected from raw warp intrusion by manner, methods, and composition of their construction. It sits at the edge of the warp without fully immersing in it. Travel through the webway requires no navigator, no Geller field against demonic incursion, no careful calibration of a warp entry point, no exposure to the temporal distortions or predatory entities that make the raw immaterium lethal. The webway is, in functional terms, the warp's primary access route to humanity cut out of the equation entirely. The Lexicanum's entry on the Webway project uses language worth sitting with. The project was the culmination of the Emperor's ambition, and its completion was his greatest concern above all other. Not the Great Crusade, not the reunification of humanity, not the creation of the Primarchs or the Space Marine Legions. Above all other concerns, the Webway project. The Lexicanum also notes that the project began during the Great Crusade and likely long before, suggesting the Emperor had been working toward this goal before the First Crusade fleet launched. The fandom wiki records the scale of the physical investment. The Emperor directed tens of thousands of Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests to modify the Golden Throne so that it could be put into use as the nexus of his secret Imperial Webway project. During the Unification Wars, buried under a desert on the Terran continent of Asia, the Emperor discovered a portal into the Webway's vast network, a remnant of Old One infrastructure, ancient beyond calculation, intact beneath centuries of accumulated ruin. He spent decades in the planning stages, and then pulled the Mechanicum's best technical minds to modify what he'd found into the entry mechanism for humanity's permanent exit from the warp. The Golden Throne, as he redesigned it, was a door, not life support, not a psychic battery, a door. The strategic logic runs through multiple canonical sources to the same conclusion. Remove humanity's dependence on warp travel. Remove the Chaos God's primary access vector to human souls. Not kill the Chaos Gods. The Emperor understood they couldn't be killed, that they were as fundamental to the warp as the warp itself. But a predator that can't reach its prey is functionally equivalent to a predator that doesn't exist. Malcador the Sigillite frames the project's scope in Master of Mankind. The Webway was only one means for protecting mankind from the lure of chaos. One means, one layer, part of a larger system. The Eldar had this advantage for millions of years and still spawned Slaanesh. The counterpoint can't be ignored, and the evidence requires addressing it directly. The fall of the Eldari didn't happen because they used the warp for travel. It happened because of what they felt and did while traveling safely through the Webway. The fandom wiki describes the process in clinical terms. A sickness of vice overtook the Eldari, generating emotional excess that coalesced in the immaterium across millennia until a nascent god stirred toward wakefulness.
Their psychic output, the raw experiential residue of sensation, pleasure, and despair at civilizational scale, fed the warp regardless of how they got between worlds. Webway transit protected them from incidental warp contact. It couldn't protect the warp from what they were generating. This is exactly why the webway alone was insufficient, and exactly why Malcador said it was only one means. The webway removed the transit vector. The imperial truth was supposed to remove the psychological vector. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient without the other. The emperor understood the Eldar precedent and designed two interlocking systems precisely because one alone wouldn't hold. Then Magnus shattered the first one. Magnus the Red was the most powerful psyker among the 20 Primarchs, stated across multiple canonical sources without significant dispute. He had spent his career developing psychic and sorcerous capabilities at and well beyond the limits the emperor considered safe. At the Council of Nicaea, the emperor issued an explicit prohibition. The kind of unconstrained sorcerous practice Magnus had developed was banned. Magnus acknowledged the ruling publicly. In private, the practice continued. During the early Horus heresy, Magnus learned through psychic investigation that Horus had been corrupted on Davin. He had genuine, urgent intelligence, information that might have changed the course of everything, delivered by a mind that genuinely loved the father he was trying to warn. Rather than use the sanctioned communication methods the emperor had established, Magnus performed a ritual of immense scope on the surface of Prospero. He projected his psychic essence across the full distance to Terra, through the warp storms the heresy was already generating, through whatever wards and barriers stood between his reaching mind and his father's attention. In 1,000 Suns, Graham McNeill records Magnus's awareness of the cost before he paid it. The consequences will be mine alone to bear. He was wrong in the most comprehensive sense possible. The ritual shattered the emperor's psychic wards around the imperial palace. These weren't incidental defensive barriers. They were the carefully constructed containment architecture around the most sensitive installation in the Imperium. Demons surged through the breach, not individual incursions. A horde, pouring into the human-made webway tunnels beneath the palace, filling the passages that were supposed to carry billions of humans in safety from world to world without touching the immaterium. The war in the webway that Master of Mankind depicts isn't a battle in any conventional sense. Custodians in golden armor, Sisters of Silence, Mechanicum constructs, fighting to hold tunnels that demons were claiming meter by meter, while the Emperor at the center poured his psychic will into the Golden Throne to keep the breach from widening into something that couldn't be closed. The fandom wiki records what the Emperor had to abandon to hold that breach. The ever-growing demand of projecting the Astronomicon upon the Emperor was one of the reasons he handed command of the Great Crusade over to the War Master Horus. Returning to Terra wasn't retirement. Completing the Webway project was the priority above all other priorities. Now he was locked in a room beneath the Himalayan range, fighting a defensive action against the consequences of one Primarch's miscalculated act of devotion, unable to leave without the breach reopening and the demonic horde reaching the surface. The mechanism deserves examination. Tzeentch had spent decades maneuvering Magnus toward exactly this moment, exploiting Magnus's genuine knowledge of prohibited techniques, his genuine love for the Emperor, and his genuine paranoia about being believed. Tzeentch created nothing. It manipulated what already existed: a Primarch's mastery, a Primarch's loyalty, a Primarch's forbidden learning. The outcome was precisely what chaos needed, and couldn't have produced through any creative act of its own. The Webway project, the Emperor's greatest work, decades of Mechanicum labor, the infrastructure that was supposed to make chaos functionally irrelevant to human civilization,
was turned into a wound by a chain of manipulation that cost chaos nothing to engineer except time. The timeline requires precision because sources frequently compress it into a single event. Magnus's breach forced the Emperor onto the throne as a containment measure, alive, psychically active, still capable of strategy but unable to leave without catastrophic consequence. Horus's blade during the siege of Terra converted that containment into something permanent by destroying the Emperor's physical viability. Two separate catastrophes, separated by years of the heresy, both following the same structural pattern. Chaos exploiting existing things, Magnus's power, Horus's ambition, rather than creating anything of its own. The door became a plug. The webway became a wound. The culmination of the Emperor's ambition, the project above all other concerns, was repurposed into emergency containment for the damage chaos caused by manipulating someone else's work. The imperial truth was the Imperium's official secular doctrine from the first days of the Unification Wars. Militant atheism, scientific rationalism, the denial of the supernatural. No gods, no warp entities with agency, no prayer, no worship, no religious practice, not tolerated in private, actively suppressed by imperial authority and the compliance of 20 legions. Every world the Great Crusade reached was expected to accept this framework as a condition of membership in humanity's reunification. The standard reading treats this as arrogance. The Emperor, fully aware that the chaos gods existed and were hostile, told a civilization they didn't exist. The contradiction seems almost self-defeating. That reading isn't wrong, but it misses what the denial was designed to accomplish. The chaos gods aren't sustained by metaphysical necessity. They require inputs. They feed on the emotions and beliefs of mortal consciousness, with directed belief and organized worship generating a more concentrated feed than incidental emotional residue. A mortal who feels rage contributes something to Khorne's sustenance. A mortal who organizes their life around rituals of bloodletting explicitly aimed at Khorne contributes something far more substantial. The distinction between incidental emotional output and organized, directed worship is the metabolic difference between ambient humidity and a water main. No doctrine can prevent humans from feeling. The Emperor understood this, or should have, across millennia of observing humanity. Anger, despair, hope, excess, and the desire for change aren't suppressible by decree. What can be suppressed is the organized, directed conversion of those emotions into worship aimed at specific warp entities. A civilization of humans who never know the chaos gods exist can't build temples to them, can't organize congregations around their names, can't pour the concentrated psychic energy of deliberate faith toward beings in the warp that grow larger when fed. Whether the Emperor articulated this internally as a starvation strategy in those precise terms, no canonical source confirms. What Master of Mankind implies, through the Emperor's interiority as rendered by Aaron Dembski-Bowden and through Malcador's articulation of the multi-layered anti-chaos architecture, is consistent with this reading. But no scene exists in which the Emperor presents the imperial truth as a metabolic weapon to a subordinate in those exact words. The logic is clean and consistent with everything else the Emperor built. The explicit documentation isn't there. What is documented in extensive canonical detail is how the strategy failed. Lorgar Aurelian built a city.
Monarchia stood on the world of Kur, sprawling, deliberate, a monument in stone and gold designed to make the Emperor's divinity visible and permanent. The Word-Bearer's Great Crusade campaigns were slow and missionary in character. They brought worlds into compliance, but they also converted them. Building religious infrastructure Lorgar believed was the Great Crusade's true purpose. The fandom wiki records the foundational fact that Lorgar believed the Emperor a god is beyond doubt, and it's likely that he held this belief before he met the object of his devotion. This belief had been generating real consequences before Monarchia was ever raised. Lorgar worshipped the Emperor, a living psychic being of immense power, genuinely present in the warp as a vast consciousness. That worship was directed psychic energy aimed at an actual entity in the Imperium. The imperial truth existed to prevent exactly this kind of directed belief from feeding anything in the warp, including the Emperor himself. But Lorgar had been doing it for decades, in full sincerity, with the full organizational machinery of an entire legion behind him, on every world they reached. The Emperor ordered the Ultramarines to raise Monarchia. Every wall, every shrine, every carved scripture, reduced to rubble by the legion that had achieved Monarchia's compliance in the first place. Then the Emperor arrived personally and confronted Lorgar among the ruins, surrounded by the ash of everything Lorgar had built in his name. The first heretic depicts Lorgar on his knees in the destruction. The Emperor's message, as transmitted through every account of the encounter, was unambiguous. Worship was precisely what the Imperium didn't need. Lorgar searched for gods that wouldn't reject him. Through Erebus and Kor Pharon, already secretly chaos-corrupted within the Word-Bearer's leadership, positioned specifically to exploit this moment, Lorgar was guided toward the warp entities that were real, ancient, and unconditionally welcoming of devotion. The fandom wiki records the outcome. Lorgar willingly gave his soul to chaos undivided once he learned that there were truly gods in the universe and that they welcomed the worship of mortals. The failure mechanism is structurally exact. The devout man the Emperor had publicly humiliated among the ruins of his life's work redirected his entire devotional apparatus toward the chaos gods. He converted. He wrote. He spread the practice through the word-bearers, then began the long corruption chain through Horus's court that the heresy required. The imperial truth was designed to prevent the chaos gods from receiving organized, directed worship. Lorgar took the energy the truth had failed to suppress and aimed it at precisely the entities the truth was designed to starve. The ecclesiarchy that replaced the imperial truth is the final structural consequence. Galaxy-wide worship of the Emperor as a god, organized, institutional, centuries sustained, directed toward a figure with genuine warp presence, generates exactly the kind of concentrated psychic feed the truth was built to eliminate. Every prayer spoken in the Emperor's name, on every world in the Imperium Sanctus, every hour of every day for 10,000 years. The strategy's replacement is the mechanism the strategy was built to prevent. The execution was disrupted by the one Primarch constitutionally incapable of not finding something to worship. What chaos has actually produced across 10,000 years follows the same pattern without exception. Chaos Space Marines. Every traitor legionary was a Space Marine first, created by the Emperor, developed through decades of the Great Crusade, equipped with gene seed derived from a Primarch who derived from the Emperor's own genetic material. Chaos didn't design a competing military template and recruit from it. It recruited from the Emperor's template, corrupted it through the influence of the ruinous powers, and mutated the results over 10,000 years of warp exposure. 9 of 20 legions fell during the heresy. Not one was replaced by a chaos-originated equivalent. The traitor legions still fighting, still boarding ships and conducting Black Crusades 10 millennia later, are still running on the imperial Astartes template the Emperor designed. The mutations and demonic corruption layered on top of that template are Chaos's contribution. The template isn't. Daemon engines. The Warhammer 40,000 wiki defines them explicitly. hybrid constructs produced by the Dark Mechanicum, the corrupted remnant of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Martian institution that fell during the heresy, created by binding demonic entities into existing machines of war. Defilers, forge fiends, mauler fiends, hell brutes. Each one is a pre-existing technological chassis, imperial in origin and mechanicum designed, with a warp entity forced inside it through dark mechanicum ritual. The daemon provides animating force. The machine provides the body. Both existed before Chaos's involvement. The dark mechanicum contributed the binding technique. Take the machines away, take the demons away, and Chaos has produced a ritual. The construction is entirely borrowed. The Eye of Terror. The most iconic Chaos stronghold in the galaxy, the region from which the traitor legions have launched 13 Black Crusades, where demon worlds orbit dying suns and the veil between the warp and real space is thin enough to breach with modest effort, wasn't constructed by the Chaos gods. It formed when Slaanesh was born in the late 29th and early 30th millennia, as the psychic shockwave of that birth tore a permanent wound between the warp and real space across what had previously been inhabited Eldari space. The fandom wiki is direct about what was there before. The Eye occupies the region of the Eldari Crone worlds, civilized space that was consumed by the catastrophe of Slaanesh's emergence. The Eye of Terror is a scar left by Chaos moving into territory defined by someone else's catastrophe. Chaos moved in after the destruction, not before. The Chaos gods themselves follow the same origin pattern. Khorne coalesced from mortal warfare's accumulated rage and bloodshed across millions of years of sentient life's conflicts. Conflicts between species the Old Ones created and the Emperor's ancestors survived. Tzeentch crystallized from hope, ambition, and the psychic residue of minds reaching toward change and possibility. Nurgle condensed from the despair and terror of mortality across countless civilizations. Slaanesh emerged from the Eldari's concentrated emotional excess. All four are emergent properties of what sentient life was already generating. They didn't create the species that fed them. They didn't design the emotions those species felt. They coalesced around psychic residue produced by minds they didn't make, in bodies they didn't build, across civilizations they didn't found. The Old Ones were the galaxy's original creative force. They built the webway. They seeded intelligent life across thousands of worlds. The Chaos gods coalesced from the emotional residue of the races the Old Ones seeded. Chaos inherited the galaxy from the Old Ones the way a parasite inherits a host, not by building anything, but by finding the existing structure and exploiting it over millions of years. No official Games Workshop publication states this as a codified universal law in those precise terms. The pattern is structural and consistent, traceable across traitor legions, demon engines, warp geography, the gods' own origins, but it has never been written as a formal rule in any canonical text.
What the evidence supports, stated at the certainty the evidence actually warrants. Every major Chaos asset, traced backward to its origin, terminates at something a non-Chaos force produced first. The consistency across 10,000 years of lore isn't coincidence. It reflects something real about how Chaos operates. And the Emperor, who had observed it operating for millennia before the Great Crusade launched, built his entire institutional response around the one thing Chaos can't close: its own inability to originate. The introduction to the 41st millennium has been printed in every Warhammer 40,000 rulebook for decades. For more than 100 centuries,
The Emperor of mankind has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. A few lines later, mighty battle fleets cross the demon-infested miasma of the warp, the only route between distant stars, their way lit by the Astronomicon, the psychic manifestation of the Emperor's will. 10,000 years. The machine is still running. The Golden Throne was designed as a door into the webway. The fandom wiki records that the Emperor found the portal during the Unification Wars, buried in the Asian deserts, and spent centuries directing the Mechanicum to transform it into the nexus of the project the Lexicanum called the culmination of his ambition. In its original conception, it was infrastructure, the entry point for a transit network that would render warp travel obsolete and remove humanity from the Chaos God's operational domain. It's now a sarcophagus with the power still running. After Magnus shattered the webway wards and Horus mortally wounded the Emperor at the Siege of Terra, the throne became something it was never meant to be. The door became a plug. The Emperor's shattered body, kept functional by ancient biomechanical technology of the Dark Age of technology, sustained by the daily sacrifice of psychers, directing the Astronomicon signal across 70,000 light-years through what remains of his psychic will, is all that stands between the breach and the surface of Terra. The Lexicanum describes his current activity. He simultaneously guides his race through the Emperor's tarot, soul-binds psychers, holds audiences with his most important servants, and directs the Astronomicon beacon that guides space vessels through the warp. The most powerful psychic being in human history, reduced to triage, maintaining what he can, sustaining the one functioning layer of a three-layer architecture. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's Master of Mankind frames the Emperor's own assessment through a line delivered to the custodian Diocletian after Magnus's breach. Horus has damned us all, not defeated the strategy, damned the conditions the strategy assumed. The Webway project's completion is gone. The imperial truth has been replaced by its structural opposite. What remains is one layer of a three-layer architecture, running on emergency protocols, powered by continuous human sacrifice, maintained by a body that should have been dust for 10,000 years. The failures of the heresy were genuine. The Webway project's destruction was a real, strategic loss of the highest order. The imperial truth's replacement by the ecclesiarchy is precisely the outcome the truth was designed to prevent. These weren't recoverable setbacks. They were catastrophic. The Emperor told a custodian that Horus had damned them all, and he was right. But the limitation chaos can't overcome hasn't changed in 10,000 years. It still can't build a replacement Astronomicon of equivalent psychic authority. It can't reconstruct the Webway's architecture or generate new transit corridors within the old one's framework. It can't produce a new Astartes template that doesn't trace back to the Emperor's gene seed. The traitor legions are still recruiting from the fallen, not generating fresh warriors from nothing. The Eye of Terror is still a wound in real estate it inherited.
The demon engines are still running on pre-chaos chassis. The Chaos Gods are still emergent properties of mortal emotional output they didn't design or create. The Astronomicon still shines from the hollow mountain. The signal, chaos can't create a competing version of, still defines where sustainable movement in the human galaxy is possible. A corpse on a throne, 10,000 years removed from the design phase, is still executing a degraded version of the same containment principle the Emperor developed before the Great Crusade's first ship crossed the void. Chaos can't create anything new. It can only corrupt what already exists. The Emperor didn't fight that limitation. He built an empire inside it. Every institution, every beacon, every project, every lie was engineered around the one thing the Chaos Gods have never been able to do:
And 10,000 years later, even from a corpse on a throne, the machine is still running. Subscribe for more stories like this.